I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And yes, of course, Nicola Yoon, that Nicola Yoon, publisher of Joy Revolution books, best-selling author, Everything, Everything. The Sun is also a star, Instructions for Dancing. And now she has her first adult novel. And I am telling you, you will yell. You will yell the way I did. There are a couple of twists in this book. It is described by the publisher as Get Out, that Get Out, meets the Stepford Wives. And actually, I think that's pretty fair, but it was also not what I was expecting from you, Nicola, for this particular book. So, hi, can we talk about where this book came from?
Well, that is the best introduction I think I may have ever had. But hi.
Hi.
Thanks for having me. This book, you know what my goal with this book was? To basically keep you up all night. And then make you scream bloody murder.
Okay, check.
Right. And then like talk to everyone you can talk to about it. Like just sort of pull them in, get your book club going and chit chat. So that was the goal.
Okay. So far, you have succeeded on my end of things because I have been doing that with everyone I work with saying, oh my God, have you guys read this yet? Because I cannot. And yes, I did stay up all night. And yes, there was yelling. There was yelling in more than one place. And especially because you would zig where I thought you were going to zag. And, you know, I read a lot.
Oh, good.
And I was still surprised. So,
I love to hear it.
And also I got very attached to the characters.
I mean, but isn't that the best way? Like you really want to be in their lives, right? That's why books breed empathy. That's why books are so, like long lasting, never go away.
And we are obviously going to be spoiler-free in this conversation because I did just describe your first adult for novels as a blend of Get Out and the Stepford Wives. Yeah. So, I mean, people might have their own impressions of what that means, but we meet a really terrific married couple.
Right.
Jasmine and King, and they have a son, Camo. Right. And you give us this sort of wonderful sense of place. And I'm going to ask you to start with the community that they're moving into, because I think that gives us a good jumping off point for the rest of this conversation.
Yeah, so Jasmine and her husband, King, and they have a 7-year-old son named Kamau, and she's pregnant, and they move to Liberty, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. It's a very, very, very wealthy suburb of Los Angeles, and it describes itself as a Black utopia. And so everyone in this community is Black, like from the janitors through the lawyers, the teachers. It's meant to be a safe place for everyone who's Black, a break from the sort of wider, larger society. And Jasmine and King are looking forward to being there.
And it's a complete community. There are restaurants, there's a post office, there's a wellness center. You really don't actually have to leave once you're there, which I find kind of fascinating. I mean, the idea that you can go home and be in a place where you don't have to translate yourself, where you don't have to look extra hard for the things that you need, even if it's something as simple as cooking dinner, right? Like there are times where you cannot find the thing you need in a standard grocery store. So the idea that they can be home, right? And just really be home and build community. And yet it's a little funky.
Right. It's meant to be this place that's safe because I think we can all relate to, just being out in the world sometimes and just feeling under siege, right? Like whether it's like a little bit of road rage to, like the side eye from some random, right? And going home to your actual home and feeling that sigh of relief. And so that's what Liberty's meant to be for all the Black people there. It's a sigh of relief. And Jasmine expects to find people who are like herself. So Jasmine's a public defender. She works with a lot of kids who've been in trouble in and out of like the police system or the jail system. And she's an activist, like very, very dedicated activist. And so she expects to find people who are as active and sort of dedicated to sort of fixing the problems of the world as she is. But that is not what she finds there. She finds that most of the neighbors like really want to go to the Liberty Wellness Center, which is this very, very fancy spa at the top of the hill. And she cannot figure out why. And so she meets a couple other people. She's trying to start a Black Lives Matter chapter. She meets a couple of other people and they try to figure out what's going on.
I love the supporting cast. Jasmine gets some genuine friendships. And it's really hard to make friends as an adult, right? Like, I mean...
so difficult.
There's the whole like school set, right? Like if you have kids in school, then they're those friends and then their neighbors, whatever. But to watch her sort of muddle her way through, like, do I want to be friends with these people? Who are these people? What's going on here? It's not something we often get to see. I mean, she's got her family.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, King works too much, but that's not the first time we've ever met someone who's working too much.
Right.
But watching her sort of figure out where she wants to be and who's who, and sort of, you give us this outsider perspective that feels really unique in a lot of ways, right? Like, she's really excited that her kid can go to school in a place where he doesn't have to explain himself.
Yes, I mean, there are so many wonderful things that liberty purports to be, right? And she really does expect that it's going to be an easy place to make friends and to find friends, because, as you say, making friends as an adult is a pain. Like, I mean, there's just that you have so many sort of stressors on you and so many demands on your time. So I think that she thinks that there's going to be a shortcut here. And then she has to figure out who really is one of her kind, which is kind of where the title is from. She really has to figure out who these people are, and are they who they say they are, right? Which it's an added layer to our normal, like trying to make friends with like the moms or whoever in your life. But, yeah.
Part of why I asked you to start with liberty, too, is the sense of place is really strong in this novel. And as you said, like, it is, you wanted a community where everyone could feel safe, and yet that there's this underpinning, this sort of thrumming of, there's
a little bit of, what's going on here? I'm not so sure. It's that feeling like a little frisson you feel sometimes when you like somehow find yourself in some place that's a little bit dangerous, and you're like, wait, did I make a wrong turn? I'm not really sure what's happening. And I wanted everyone to feel a little bit off kilter, right? Because there are a bunch of assumptions that Jasmine has made, and I wanted to question those assumptions. Like, why she decided that this was going to be safe, really. So I think that's what I was trying to do there.
She also has a little bit of guilt for leaving their old community behind, though. And she does go back for a moment, and she's kind of like, well, why again did we leave? I mean, because you're partially writing about money, you're partially writing about class, like, who makes it? Who gets out? What does that look like? What is leaving behind an old community and trading it in for a new one look like? And that's slightly new material for you, I feel like, at least in terms of literature, right? So, I mean, obviously, that's a huge piece of the world we're living in now, right? Like, who has what and who doesn't, and who gets left behind.
I think we talk a lot about race in America. I don't think we talk a lot about class, and especially where those two intersect a lot. And we ought to, because there's a lot of it there. There's Isabel Wilkerson's book. It's called Caste, which I really love her perspective on, the intersection of those things and caste. But I do think that, there's a way in which I think that we assume that money is protective, especially if you're Black, and it's not necessarily, right? And I do think that there is some guilt when you become successful. And I do think there is a way in which you can feel trapped by so many things when you're Black, right? Like, what are you actually supposed to do? And so that's where Jasmine's guilt and sort of, she's not really sure how she should fit. And she feels this like sort of overwhelming sense of, I'm not doing the right thing. I need to do more.
Well, and passing works into that a little bit. And it's wild to me that we're still having, passing is something that I think of more in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And that's on me. That's my sort of historical warping, right? But passing is still, it's a cultural thing as well as a race thing. And I mean, there have been some great Brit Bennett's last novel. The Vanishing Half is fantastic. If you haven't read it, please go read it.
Yes, everyone go read it.
Oh, it's so good. But the way she handles passing sort of in the present day, right? This is not a historical thing. This is not, I mean, there are people who choose to pass in 2024, right? Because in some ways it is easier. And passing is something that you take up kind of from the side. Let's say you come at it sideways a little bit. And it's partially signifiers like speech patterns. It's not just skin color.
Right.
I mean, you're really digging it. You really dig in on a lot of stuff in this book.
Right. I mean, and the question is, what does it mean to pass, right? Like if someone is quote unquote white, like they look white, and then we say they're black, what do we mean when we say that? Is it a cultural? Is it something else? Is it something deeper? Like, and I think it's important to say, for me, the book is mostly a question, right? Like there are no answers actually in this book. Like I really super want people to just talk amongst themselves. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting when we say people pass, and then we talk about code switching too, which we all do, right? Because like the way I talk to my husband is not the way I talk to like the random person on the street, right? So we all code switch to a certain extent. And then there is a deeper like cultural code switch. There's a class code switch. There's so many different types of doing that. And so, passing and code switching intersect too. But I really wanted to question what it means to pass then, especially in 2024.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of what I love about this book, too, is that you're not presenting I mean, yes, the story goes a certain place without a doubt. But, I mean, everything is kind of open-ended and everyone is actually well-intentioned. There is no actual, megalomaniac behind the scenes sort of, running their hands together kind of thing. It really is. Everyone is very well-intentioned and using their skills to the best of their ability to make a new space. And I mean, utopias don't always have a great run. I think if you look at American history, there have been some attempts at utopias that didn't work.
They end poorly, generally.
Yeah, all of it is complicated. But there's one question that you ask throughout One of Our Kind, and it pops up in different ways. But at one point, you actually have a character say this: "Are we our history?"
Yeah.
Right. And I think this is something, I mean, and it's not just within the Black community. I mean, we see it in the Asian American community. We see it in Latino community. Like we see it in all kinds of communities, even sort of small rural communities, right? Like what is our past? How does that create who we are and how we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question you can ask it culturally, like who are we depending on our history, but just individually too, right? I mean, I come from Jamaica and, I have like a varied history. And does that make me? Is it the only thing that makes me?
Right.
I guess I will say that this book was sparked by a couple of things. And one of them was a question from a friend of mine. And he is Black and an activist. And we had gone to a panel on race and racism. And we were on the panel. And afterwards we went to dinner and we were like drinking wine and all this. And he said, who do you think you would be? Who would we be as a people if it weren't for race and racism? Like he just asked me like on our first glass of wine, which I was like, listen, I was like, I need like the bottle for this conversation. But it was like it's a great question and one I've been thinking about, I think, since I moved to America, and it's an interesting question, but it's an impossible question because it's hard to tease out who you would be if everything were completely different, right? And the thing I've been saying about this is like, it's like asking fish, like, what's the world without water? Like, you can't get away from it. And so that's like the heart of the book too, is what makes us, given that we live in America and obviously there are problems, right? How do we get to be free? What does freedom look like given all the history? And not only the history, but the present. So, that's really what the book is trying to figure out.
And we're also not a monolithic culture, right? Like as Americans, we're not a monolithic culture, even as subsets of, whatever our identifier is. Like we're not monoliths within our communities, right? And that, I think, at least it was an eye-opener for me when I started to understand that some folks had some very, very different opinions from mine in ways that felt very fundamental. And one of the things I think that's really interesting about One of Our Kind is you're talking about adult relationships, grown-up marriages, and the complications that come with that. And I think there are a lot of your readers who are very used to sort of the first blush kind of thing and watching the coming of age. And I mean, they're great stories, but to switch gears like this and suddenly be digging it, like, you can have bumps and still love your person.
Right, yeah.
But if there's a fundamental, like, we don't agree on what humanity actually represents.
Yeah.
That's a whole different thing.
Yeah. I mean, I love my young adult stories. I love them, I think, especially because they tend to be more philosophical because I'm like in conversation with kids, right? Or younger people who are questioning. And then as we get older, we tend to shut down that questioning a little bit, which is a tragedy, honestly, because we really should still be asking a lot of questions about the world and what does it mean to be in it and like what's your place in it. This was obviously going to be an adult book from the very beginning when I first thought of it because I really wanted to tackle these like sort of more adult themes and a marriage and like the ways in which you stop seeing things in marriages, especially long, happy ones, right? Yeah, that's definitely not for like my 17-year-old protagonists.
No, and also, I mean, sometimes you want to read about the 17-year-old protagonist who's figuring it out, and sometimes you want to be like, oh, right, I recognize that. That was Tuesday. Marriage is something that sometimes it's, you know, we get a lot of literature about what happens after the marriage blows up, right? Like, and that's great reading in its own. I mean, I can think of a million fun novels where I'm like, oh, yeah, figuring it out after. But it is in some ways a little trickier to do what you're doing, which is taking this dystopian world, right? This fantasy world, and also grounding it in a way that we recognize, you know? And I mean, it's a trick that you pull in the other books too, but here, I feel like you're playing a little bit, well, maybe not with a hand grenade, but there's a little bit of barbed wire rolling through some of what's happening here.
I mean, I know, but I had to like, I wrote the first draft of this in 6 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Which is, I promise you, not a thing that's ever happened before and will never happen again.
Okay.
But it just sort of came out all at once. And I really think it's because I've been thinking about these questions for such a long time. And then, you know, it took me 3 years to revise it after that. So it was 3 years and 6 weeks. Right. But, you know, the thing about being in a long and happy marriage is that you make assumptions about each other and there is love, right? But what happens when the love means different things to different people? And I think that's where, you know, Jasmine and King maybe find themselves.
Oh, yeah. I'm trying not to give anything. I just had so much fun reading One of Our Kind. And again, I realize what I used as comps, so I don't really know what that says about me, but I really enjoyed the three. Did writing this book change you, though? Did it free you up in a way? I mean, I get that you wrote the first draft in 6 weeks, but I mean, you still spent 3 years with a draft. And that's a lot of rewriting, and that's a lot of thinking, and that's a lot of living in this world that's slightly complicated. But I mean, do you feel like you're different now that you've done this book?
You know, I couldn't have done this book before I did it. Like, I don't think that I was a skilled enough writer to pull it off before. And it's funny how books find you, or, you know, as a writer, it just takes a while to get to emotionally, but also just craft-wise. I am different. I don't know that I've answered any of the questions I've asked, but I needed to ask them. It took me forever to write the ending, even though I knew it from the very beginning. Like, I revised it so many times. And mostly because it was very, very emotional for me in a way that I think that nothing has been as emotional as writing that ending. And my editor, who's just great, kept pushing me. She kept saying, you have to earn this, like all the rest of it. And I knew I had to. Like, the ending had to make sense. You had to feel like this was inevitable. And so, like, I grew as a writer, rewriting that ending a million times. And emotionally, I felt like, okay, I've said all the things I really wanted to now. Or I've asked all the questions I really want to now.
I mean, the ending felt very organic to me, and I didn't live with it for 3 years. I mean, like, when I say I read it in a night, I read really quickly, but also page turner. But I'm just thinking about something you said a second ago where you said, well, I've asked all these questions and I don't know if I've really answered them. And I'm sort of sitting here saying, well, why does it fall to you to answer them? Because, I mean, putting a book out into the world, right, is starting a conversation with people you've never met.
Yes.
I mean, you've met some of your readers, sure, but we all bring something to the book. And I will say, shout out to Baldwin Hills and the movie theater there. I love that movie theater. You know the one I'm talking about.
Yes, I do.
At the mall. It's so great. But the idea that we can sit with stuff that makes us deeply uncomfortable about people we love or people with whom we are in community, and yet you look at them and go, wow, you just said that.
Right. And so that is like my dearest wish for this book. I think in a way that I've never wished for a reception before is that people will actually talk to each other with grace. Because I think so much grace is missing from our conversation. Because I always say this, and I really truly believe that most people will do the right thing if they know what the right thing is, right? Yeah. And I do think that we make mistakes all the time. But if you don't assume that the other person is coming from a bad place, just a place of like sort of ignorance or whatever, you can get really far, right? You can get really far by going, that is the dumbest question I've ever heard, in a teasing way, and like explaining and moving on, and get really far by really listening too. Like I make a ton of mistakes. I have screwed up with my friends culturally and in all ways, but they know that I love them and they love me. And that is a place to start. And I really believe that. And we don't get anywhere yelling at each other, which is, I feel like such a, like Pollyanna, but grace is hard work, you know? Like you have to really mean it. You have to really pay attention. The only way things change is when we have an actual connection, like you and me in a room, in a conversation. And so my greatest wish for this book is that after you throw it across the room because you're like, what the hell? then you talk to your people within your circles, outside of your circles about it.
Well, I think too, you know, riffing off of something you just said, love and hope are both muscles, and they're really hard sometimes. Yes. Like sometimes you just got to work them. Yes. And I don't mean love in the let's go do Valentine's Day kind of love. Like loving your community and loving the world. It's really hard. And some days it's just like you want to throw in the towel and be like, I can't do this. And yet you can't, like, if we all sort of step back and say, I can't do that, then where do we go? Right. And again, you do some clever things in this novel, and I'm not going to talk about the details per se, but you do some really clever things, and especially with language and with mapping trauma, and just the way you do it is very clever and
thank you.
Really absorbing. There's a moment where Jasmine meets a person and is telling her story for a very specific reason. And at first I'm like, okay, maybe this is helpful. Maybe this is good. And then, yeah. So, I mean, you kept doing it. I'm smiling, just laughing about this, which is kind of terrible because, I mean, we know where some of the story goes. But just watching you do this, right? You feel really loose on the, you feel really loose on the page, though. I can see you puzzling it out, but like you feel really loose on the page, and I can see you asking these questions and not feeling like you need to answer them, which I really respect.
Right. No, I don't. I mean, some of them are unanswerable. Some of them it's worth it just to ask. But this, more than any other book, was a puzzle for me, right? So I needed to put all the pieces, because I've never written a thriller before. I mean, I like to think the books are page turners, but this one was like really, like I really wanted it to be compelling. And so this one, more than the others, felt like a puzzle that I was putting together, and I was planting all these seeds so that you would be rewarded on a second read, you know?
Oh, yeah, completely. I can see that.
Right. Like one of my favorite things is when you read a thing and you go, oh, wait, did they just pull the rug or did they set this up? And when you reread it, you go, oh, they did. They did set it up. Like The Usual Suspects, that movie, is like one of those perfect movies because when you rewatch it, you're like, oh, they told us at the beginning and we just weren't paying attention.
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you're talking about. But did you outline? I mean, I'm vaguely remembering that you're not really an outliner, or do I have that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do a loose outline. For this, I was pretty strict, but I mean, I really knew where it was going.
Okay.
I was sure about the ending, and so everything was pushing towards that the whole time. So when you have that, there's momentum, you know, like with the writing.
I want to switch gears only slightly because I am worried that I am going to dip into spoiler territory, and I refuse. On principle, I refuse. But I want to talk about the imprint that you have with your husband. It's called Joy Revolution, and I love the name of it.
Yeah.
And also, you know, romance, not quite my thing in the way it is your thing, but I love the fact that the books exist and that the sort of, the community around romance has been changing, and you have been part of that. And can we talk about where Joy Revolution is now and how many books you have out and where you think you're taking the imprint, because it's a pretty groovy project.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I love Joy Revolution. It's definitely passion project, you know. We've published, I think, 8 books at this point.
Okay.
We're doing 6 a year, and you know, it's stories written by people of color, love stories.
Yeah.
Big, passionate, swoony, lots of kissing love stories written by people of color, starring people of color. David and I have had this idea since graduate school. That's where we met. And we really wanted to do, because look, all of our favorite movies, just like the Black girl was a sassy side character. And David always says that, like, the Asian dude is always like the lab tech, like, that's telling you, like, oh, it's a boy or whatever. And he's like, that's just, it's ridiculous. Like, we fall in love, like, people of color fall in love all the time, right? So, like, why aren't we, like, the main characters in stories? So, I mean, where we're going with it is we're just going to keep publishing these books, right? Like, we took a bet that people wanted to read them and that there were writers of them. And so far, so good, right? We've been right. Like, there are people who want to write them and want to read them. I mean, honestly, though, if I'm being, like, totally, completely honest, my dearest wish is that one day there is no need for the Joy Revolution imprint.
Right.
That would be ideal, right? So that I don't have to keep saying to people of color fall in love every day, and we deserve to star in our own love stories, and we deserve the full measure of our humanity. So one day in the future, Joy Revolution will dissolve because we'll have solved all the world's problems.
Well, I mean, hopefully, but also, you know, we do also have families, and we can have domestic dramas where people are sitting around the table at dinner because a parent is dying. Like, we don't also have to have, you know, every single story being
an issue story.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, we contain multitudes, right? We really do. It's, you know, and I don't want to pick on stuff that's been out in the world and whatnot, because I'm just happy to see whatever we can get out there. But at the same time, like, I look at my family sometimes and I'm like, yeah, we exist too. And we're just like, we're so boring. We're so boring.
I completely agree, because I think that, you know, they're the sort of issue books, right? I mean, it's what you think of when you think of books with people of color. Like, it's always sort of, you know, maybe it's immigration or it's race and obviously those, you have to write about those things because we still live in America, a place that's striving to be better, but it's not there, right? And so issues still exist and we have to write about them, but we have to write about other things too. I do think it's important for us to say that, you know, issue is not the entirety of us, right? We do also relax and have families and have big aspirations and ambitions and do the wrong thing and do the right thing. And we're vulnerable and strong, right? We're not just one thing. We contain multitudes, as you just said, right? And so we need to tell those stories as well.
I just want both. That's all I'm asking for. I want both. I don't actually want to give up the issue fiction either, because when it's done well, it's spectacular.
Right.
I just would like to be able to read, you know, The Hours, only maybe it's a bunch of Asian people and people are Black people. You know what I mean? Like, we can do that too. Like, our moms, they're throwing flour in the kitchen too. You know? They want to just check into a hotel and read for a day because they're like really over us.
Throwing flour in the kitchen. There's always that scene where they're like dancing around this fabulous kitchen, like practical magic, and you're like,
all of it, right?
Why? How come it's only white girls that dance around the kitchen? I don't understand what's happening.
Oh, my mom tried to teach me how to foxtrot, and I can tell you it did not go well. But that's also like just a straight up, you know, that's just a coordination issue. But more importantly, it would be nice to get to a point where Joy Revolution could maybe be something else or not need to be in the world. But the reality is books do reflect our art. You know, our art reflects who we are and who our communities are and what we're doing. So I don't want to lose all of it yet, but what I didn't know about you until I was researching for the show is you started out as an electrical engineer. Wait, can we talk about this for a second? Because I did not know that. I just assumed, you know, maybe you'd been in advertising or something, because, you know, a lot of advertising, you know, Salman Rushdie was working in advertising for a while.
David, my husband, was working in advertising.
Okay, so David worked in advertising.
Yeah.
But electrical engineering...
Yes, I always say math led me astray because I was good at math in high school, and I had this fabulous math teacher, Mr. Waterman, who like really recognized that I was good at it. And then I went to Cornell and majored in electrical engineering, and electrical engineering is just a lot of math.
It was never in my future.
It's like absurd. And then it was my senior year that I had to take a class outside of my major, and I took a writing class, and that's when like everything fell off the cliff for me. I was just like, oh wait, writing.
Although, you could argue that like language and math are totally unrelated. I had an uncle who was an actual rocket scientist who was like, no, seriously, foreign language, music, and math. And I'm looking at him going, the language part.
It's true.
Language part I understand. Music is not my ask anyone in the family, and I'm the one who's tone deaf, so I can't.
I am also tone deaf, so more power to us.
You understand. Okay, so you end up going to graduate school at Emerson. You meet your husband. You're working on all sorts of different things, but ultimately you end up writing YA first, which isn't traditionally what happens when you come out of an MFA program. So can we spend a minute talking about that trajectory and how you got to everything, or what became everything, because everything sort of launches from there, right?
Right, it does. It's funny because when I started writing everything, I don't think I knew that I was writing like a young adult book. Okay. I didn't even really, I was so shockingly naive about the industry, which is not a knock on like Emerson and stuff, but we don't learn so much about the industry in graduate school. It's more like, the writing, which is great, but also I think we need a little bit more maybe of what the world you're publishing into is. And so I didn't really know. I just knew that I was writing about this 17-year-old girl. I had just had Penny, my little girl. I started writing that book when she was 3 months old. And it came out of having a new kid and being a nervous mom and just being basically just an insane person for a while in those beginning months, because you're just like, how am I supposed to make this child live in the world? I'm not good at it yet. So that's where that came from. And then I began to understand of the world. And then she's 17, and then this young adult is this category. And then it's a natural fit for me too, though, because of what I was saying before, because kids are philosophical. Yeah. Whether or not they mean to be philosophical, they are, because they really are so questioning. And that is my nature. Like I am the person that you don't want to sit next to at dinner, because I'm always going, well, what does that really mean? Like, what is the mean? I'm obnoxious, and I'm irritating to be around.
No, kids notice way more than we give them credit for noticing. Yeah. Like, we have to we really should stop treating them like they're not all there, because the majority of tiny people I have met they notice everything. And they are on it. And they're just like, what is going on here? And who are you people?
My child is 12. It's so annoying to be around because she notices. I mean, I adore her, but my God, everything. You can get away with nothing.
I remember being that way at 12 too. I was like, wait, you guys have the keys? How do you have the keys? No, absolutely not. But can we talk about literary influences too? Because I feel like you're pulling from lots of different places when character obviously is the thing that drives you the most. Yeah. Questions in one of our kind. But if I'm reading one of your books, my first thought is, oh, who am I going to meet? Who are these people? God, I have so many influences. I mean, I'll start with like the silly stuff. Like I read a lot of romance, but I mean, I like the greats too. Like, Toni Morrison, obviously. My favorite book of all time is The Little Prince. Oh, interesting. Okay, wait. Before we go any further, though, really, The Tiny French Prince?
Yes, The Tiny French Prince.
Is it because it's so philosophical?
Yes, it is because of that. It's because it introduced me to this way of like looking at the world. I mean, he would go from place to place and discover himself. And then what does he end up thinking? Like love is the thing. Which is what I think too, right? And I don't just mean like the big swooning romantic one. Right. Just all of it, right? Like the depth of it. It's the thing that makes the world go round. And I think that book says that, like in a very small way. And it's such a tiny, tiny book, but it's like a perfect book. What else? I mean, I read compulsively. I read 2 books a week, at least. And so I have like too many influences. Kazuo Ishiguro is like a hero of mine.
Remains of the Day is a perfect novel. It is actually a perfect novel. And usually World War II fiction and I are kind of like, peace out. That's, there are plenty of people who, and it's a perfect book.
I mean, when you like, that's the kind of book when you read it, you go, "Oh, I have to be a better writer." Like I feel like I gotta step it up. I don't know, I'm never gonna get there. It's one of those that you admire it and you're like, "Oh, it hurts. It's so good. It hurts."
Every sentence in that book
Perfect.
has a place, and you're just like, wait a minute,
I
what did
know.
I? And when you're done, and it's tiny too, it's like 200 pages, maybe 220. I mean,
Yeah.
it is tiny. And when you're done, you're just like, what just happened to me?
Yeah,
Because
it's
you're
beautiful.
transported,
Yeah.
and yet you get so involved in these people's very, very tragic lives.
I also love a good like speculative, like,
Hmm.
you know, let's look at the world a little bit off kilter so we can
Hmm.
see like
Yeah.
Never Let Me Go, for instance, is
Yeah.
like one of those. That's such a
Yeah.
beautiful book.
Do you think you're just going to keep alternating between YA and writing for adults? Because, I mean, I do know that, yes, there are a lot of adults who do read YA, but it's a very different reading experience. And I'm working off the assumption, too, that it's a very different writing experience for you.
You know, I don't, it's funny because I think a few people have asked me if it's a different writing experience, and it's not
Mm.
really.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, so far, we've only written one adult book, so we'll see
Okay.
how it keeps going. But it's so much about character for me that
Okay.
when I just knew that this was not a young adult book, right? And so therefore everything shifts in my brain, in my attitude, in the way I write the sentences, like down to the sentence level, it's different. And so, but it's an easy adjustment because it's so character driven. Like it's just, I just try to inhabit the world of the characters and the writing changes in that way. Ideally, I would love to be able, like every writer in the world, you just want to write what you want to write, right? Like market forces be damned, right? So ideally, I'll get to shift between and, you know, maybe my next adult book will be set in space. I have no idea.
Right.
I
Okay.
don't have the idea for it yet, but my ideal career is that I get to go where the art takes me, right?
Was Jasmine the first character who showed up when you sat down to draft One of Our Kind?
Yes. Jasmine, our pain in the butt main character, yes.
Oh, I don't know if she's that. I wouldn't describe her as a pain in the butt. I mean, I got very attached to her very quickly. And, you know, again, I sort of raise an eyebrow to authority in real life. And so I tend to do that on the page as well.
Yeah.
Totally guilty of that. So there were some folks where I raised an eyebrow pretty early on, too.
Yeah.
But I really appreciated having her sort of working her stuff out. Right. Like I've said this before on the show, like a coming of age should not be limited to an adolescent. Right.
Yes.
Like
Oh, I love that.
We should be able to, like, if you're 60 and you're finally getting better to do it at 60 than not at all, you know, or 80 or whatever.
I think that's really great because I mean, it's what I was saying before too. Like we sort of stop questioning as adults, but if we were, because lack of change is death, right? So we do actually need to keep questioning, growing, and changing. So I really love that you said that. Yeah, and I think Jasmine is just complicated, right? She's like anyone, right? She contains multitudes, and sometimes those multitudes contradict each other, right?
But did she surprise you?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, Jasmine functions on love. Her driving motivation, her engine is love, and love is complicated.
Oh, yes. Sorry. I'm just thinking about some of her sidekicks in her group chat and stuff gets very complicated. Her group chat gets complicated very
Her group chat is very funny, yeah.
Well, and I appreciate the fact that you were switching back and forth between formats, too. Like, we get sort of some magazine articles and we get group chat, and it's not just prose sort of laid out. Like, you're letting the story tell itself in a very organic way, in ways that would also be familiar to us, even though some of the details are a little funky.
Right. Yeah. It's so hard not to like talk about the ending. Yeah, you know, that's like a personal quirk. I really love breaking format. I think I've done it in every book that I've written. Like I don't know why my brain just works that way. It just does. Like I do enjoy breaking the format. And also in this book in particular, I really think those magazine articles and stuff sort of help and they build the mystery. Funnily enough, I added them at the end of the writing process. I went back and threaded them through because I think I needed to have the whole thing first. And then I went back and, yeah.
Well, especially when I think about who those magazine articles are about, that makes now I'm sounding just kind of spacey, but I'm really not being spacey about this. I'm just avoiding spoilers. But that makes perfect sense. it was a really organic and complete experience. Because I will say, the first time I saw the copy from your publisher, I was like, okay. But it's Nicola Yoon, and she will most likely pull this off. But I mean, that's a lot. And some people have also used Rosemary's Baby. And I'm like, that's a lot to put on a single book, right? And at the same time, like, my skin was crawling in all of the places it should have been crawling. And at the same time, I was in a place where I could ask questions and challenge my own sort of preconceptions, which I like that. I like it when a book doesn't let me get lazy. Everyone has their preference for what they read. And there is a book for absolutely, like, if you, you're not, I've had people say to me, I'm not a reader. And I'm like, you just haven't met the book.
Yeah, you just don't.
Literally
you
have not
found
met
it yet. Yeah.
And when you do, it will blow your mind wide open.
And it's over, because then you will be like, give me another one just like it. Yeah.
And you know, regardless of what age, like, it can happen when you're 10, it can happen when you're 50. Like, you just have to find the thing.
Yeah.
And I do feel like you're going to end up with a new kind of audience for this particular book. I mean, it is wildly different in a lot of ways from the earlier work.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was talking to someone about this, and I think the only common thread is that I think all the books have questions in them, right? Yeah. Like there's always a question that I'm trying to answer, because that's how I write. Like, I'm writing my way through something. And I think that is the commonality. So, like, the books are all philosophical. But yeah, this one is different, right? Like, there's not so much swooning or any swooning in this one.
Well, we know that there was swooning.
We do.
We know there was a lot of swooning.
That there is love, right? Yeah, like, this book is driven by love, but as I say, love is complicated, right? And it looks differently to different people.
Have you figured out what the next question you want to ask for the next book is?
I have no idea. I'm circling it. Like, I can feel that I'm circling it, but I don't have it yet.
Okay. I mean, fair enough. I mean, this one, you did just finish this one, so I don't want to push too much. But I'm really curious, because, again, I feel like you were really looser on the page with this book, and partially because of the questions you were asking, but also I don't know if you gave yourself permission to treat this differently. I know you said the writing process was not different, but something does feel different. And maybe it's just me bringing, me to your book, but it feels a little different. I think there are going to be some readers who are a little surprised. Let's put it that way.
I felt this was the moment to write this in a way that I think I haven't always necessarily felt, right? Like, I was just there and I was doing it. I did it for me. I did it all at once. It is different than the other books, and I felt different writing it, but I couldn't have written it before.
Yeah. I actually love that line. Nicola, we're getting dangerously close to spoilers again. We keep getting close to spoilers and we dance back.
We want to talk about it. We do.
There's so much. So I'm just going to say to listeners, go grab a copy of One of Our Kind and then grab everyone you know and start talking to them about it, because there is so much here. There's just so much. And then, of course, there's all of Nicola's backlist as well. And they're the books from Joy Revolution. And I'm going to put in a plug for David's books, too. Don't forget, David Yoon also writes.
Best writer ever, honestly.
So there is so much. There's so much out there, but start with One of Our Kind and see where that gets you. Nicola, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was one of my favorite conversations, hands down.
Thank you.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of wonderful books to pick up when you stop in for One of Our Kind. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I am joined by my newer and very favorite book buddy, Donald, out in the Detroit area. And I'm going to actually have him just kick things right off, because I know he is stoked to talk about this title.
Thank you, Mark. I couldn't be more excited. So, as a tie-in book for One of Our Kind, I picked, first of all, an author that is just unprecedented. Everybody knows her name, but I picked an unconventional one that not a lot of people talk about, and that's Paradise by Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize-winning author. It is my third favorite book of all time, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a second, but this novel and why I picked it, it's because while it's about race, it's also very unique and unexpected in the way it talks about race and how it handles race within the community of Ruby, which, like Liberty from One of Our Kind, is trying to be its own utopia. It's a story filled with folklore, memory, religion, but even more so, it's about individual and communal identity. And when that's threatened by the so-called women of the convent, it becomes a brutal and powerful story that has one of the most powerful first lines ever that I've ever read. And it goes, "They shoot the white girl first. With the rest, they take their time." And why that is such an powerful, important first line, when you read this amazing book, it becomes very clear as you get through. But going back to the community aspect, the men of Ruby are dealing with frustration and dread as things begin to happen in the town. And they start blaming these women for all the accidents and all of the hardship and all the bad things that are happening to their town. Because the women have moved away, they're looked at as maybe like witches, they're cursing the town. And the novel itself is actually broken into several chapters focusing on a different woman from the convent and her story. A little bit of interesting background is that this book was originally going to be called War, but the publisher felt it was too negative and too harsh. And yet, Paradise is almost the perfect title for this book. If you get a chance to listen to the audiobook, Toni Morrison reads this, you fall in love with her voice. And then in this particular book, I wanted to throw a little added piece here at the end, again, to tie it in with one of our kind and thinking about musical background. While you're reading, or however you like to read books, put on Tracy Chapman's Let It Rain album, and that will lend some gravity to this wonderful book. And again, that was Toni Morrison and her book Paradise. Mark, what do you have for us this time?
That was brilliant. And any opportunity to throw Tracy Chapman into a conversation is a win in my heart and in my soul. Nice work. So when I saw some early buzz for One of Our Kind, it was kind of talked up as Get Out meets Stepford Wives. So I couldn't not talk about Jordan Peele's more recent and absolutely brilliant anthology called Out There Screaming, an anthology of Black horror. Oh my God, this book was so good. So Jordan Peele is a powerhouse when it comes to capturing what horror can mean, and using it as a through line to tell very important stories about our culture. And the stories that he has amassed for this anthology collection do something very, very similar. So he's brought in an incredible cast of writers. You've got N.K. Jemisin, you have Maurice Brodus, you have Ezra Clayton, you have L.D. Lewis. Ooh, yes. And that's just a tiny taste of the immense talent that is filling this book. The stories are strange and scary, to be sure, but they're also provocative and intelligent and deeply moving. You will experience an alien invasion. You will experience a play at Reclaiming the Dead. You will experience a very unsettling utopia community. You'll experience children facing monsters that are real and monsters that are metaphorical. And with writing like this, it's such a great time to be a fan of horror. When you have authors producing this kind of work, everybody should be excited. It's a real beautiful buffet of brilliant writing, of legitimate scares, of that feeling of cold at the back of your neck, but also something that makes you want to have a conversation with literally anybody next to you. So please check out There Screaming by Jordan Peele. But that is all we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Pour It Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
You can follow at BN Fairlane Green.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Pour It Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.